Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Maureen O'Connor from Quilters Heaven in Northbrook, Illinois, and I am the Opinionated Quilter. Today's episode number 179 is make a great scrap quilt with your 2.5-inch squares. But first, if you are into scrap quilts, I'd like to encourage you to watch Di from Sister Chick's recent episode, and we'll have a link down below for you to go to that video. It's a two-tone chain quilt that's easy, fast, and I think it turned out fantastic. So another great scrap quilt besides the one I'm going to show you today. Let's get to it. I recently quilted a quilt on my long arm for a customer who has so many scraps that her quilt was, the top was all a scrap quilt and the back was all a scrap quilt. But this is the one that was on the top. And as I quilted it, it was such a good use of 2.5-inch squares. And I know so many of you have both 2.5-inch squares and 2.5-inch strips from leftover jelly rolls and such, that even though I haven't made one myself, it's just such a good use of them that I wanted to share it with you. So it's made up of two blocks. The main block is a 16 patch, and then it has an alternate block that has little half square triangles of print, and the rest is background. This is only half of the block. This would continue on, this would continue on, and I've got a sample here to show you. Now, I know this is not beautiful, but I just took scraps and junky fabric to show you how it works. But here's the alternate block. So then there'd be another 16 patch here, another alternate block up here. And what you see as you look at the quilt is this shape of the prints and then all background. And as I looked at the quilt, I thought, oh, she probably used the stitch and flip method. And Maria, who belongs to a bee that just makes scrap quilts, walked by and said, oh, we made that quilt in our bee, but we did it with half square triangles and squares. And then I thought, well, I'm not a big stitch and flip fan, because of the waste of getting the extra half square triangles and then either putting them in the scrap heap or trying to find a use for the half square triangles. I like the corner pop method, where you take off the background corner and replace it with a print triangle. Let's go down to the table and we'll show you the three different methods for the alternate block. Here is the half square triangles and squares. So after you make your two half square triangles with background and print, you then pair them with squares of the background and then you sew them all together. In the stitch and flip method, which is what my customer used, you take a background square and then you take a square of your print, draw a line corner to corner, sew along the line, which I've done here, flip it back, press, and you cut this away, and this is the waist you get. So from each one of these squares you get 2 of these, and then you need 4 of these to make up the alternate square block. And in the corner pop method, this is Deb Tucker's corner pop, and it gives all the instructions for all the different sizes with the ruler. But what this does is you first cut away these squares from the background, and then you replace them. You take one square and then cut it diagonally and put it on, sew it, and it's a little bit oversized. So then after you press these, you then trim to size. So it has less waste than this size. Now, if there's ever an example of there's always an exception to the rule, this is it. So we're going to switch out the whiteboards and show you why we choose one method over another. When I'm deciding what method to use to make a unit, I think about what's the best use of the fabric, what's the most efficient way to sew it, less sewing makes it more efficient, and well, I guess this is really part of how efficient fabric, how much leftovers am I going to have, because I do not want to put anything into my scrap bin if I don't have to. So let's go over the methods. The first one I showed you was the half square triangles and squares, and that uses less fabric. Now I compared it to my customer's quilt who did hers 9 by 9, so that means it's 81 squares. If I were going to make it, which I'm not at any time in the near future, just because I have got other ones to work on, I would do it 8 by 10 and make it 80 squares, but virtually pretty much almost exactly the same amount. And I did the math, and what you save by doing the half square triangles and squares is 1/4 yard of fabric. That to me is not enough when you think about what I showed you in the method. Is look at how many more seams there are here. Besides the sewing from here to here, you've got this seam, and this seam. So much more sewing. So I said 1/4 yard is not enough savings for the increased amount of time. So that takes us down to stitch and flip and corner pop. Now your background fabric is cut exactly the same. You're going to need in either example the 72 square or the 64 by 80, you're going to need 40 alternate blocks. And so your background fabric is exactly the same. That doesn't make a difference. The difference was you in the stitch and flip, you get the extra half square triangles. You get double in the stitch and flip. But with the corner pop, while you use 1 square cut in half diagonally to make each 1/4 of the alternate square, rather than 2 here, it's a bigger square. And it's oversized and you trim it down. So look at the difference. 25 inches equivalent of width of fabric for the print, 22 3/4 for the corner pop. That's such a little difference that I don't factor into my decision. It's too close. Now I have to say, what makes the most sense? Well, the major benefit to me of the stitch and flip is it uses those 2.5 inch squares you have, especially if they're already cut. The major benefit to me on the corner pop, it's usually because it's less fabric, but in this case we just said it's not enough less fabric to make it a difference. The difference is that the print fabric, you can press it either way. You can press towards the print fabric or away from the print fabric, or towards the background if you so choose, which I would, because that gets these seams to nest. One's pressed one way, one's pressed the other way, and they nest. If you did all stitch and flip where they're all pressed out, then they're not going to nest that way. So if I were to make this, I would actually, after trimming my triangles, I would press half of them one way and half of them the other way, so that they would then nest. So that is a little extra step. So in the end, what would I choose? This is where I said just a minute ago that there's always an exception to the rule. I chose, if I were to do it, the stitch and flip method. Why? Because if you have a bucket like this, now I'm working on a 1.5 by 2.5 inch quilt pattern. So mine are all the 1.5 by 2.5 inch pieces. But look at this bucket. If this were 2.5 inch squares, I want to use them. And to use them and just have this cut off of each one, to me, then this, I'm not going to sew these together and find a project to use these half square triangles. These are going to go in the dog bed stuffing bag. And I am going to make much quicker use of my 2.5 inch squares if I do the stitch and flip method rather than cutting 3.25 inch squares to do the corner pop method. So just an example, every project is different. Your goals may be different. You may choose a different option. For example, you may have a whole bunch of half square triangles already made from cutoffs from other projects. And even though there's more sewing, you would be able to use more of them this way. So everybody's different. Your scrap pile can look different than my scrap pile, hence you make a different choice. Now, the one last thing I want to say is about cutting your 2.5 inch squares. In both Di's quilt that uses 2.5 inch squares and this quilt that uses 2.5 inch squares, if you don't have them cut already and you're cutting them from 2.5 inch strips, rather than cut, whether you stack 2 strips or 4 strips, rather than put your ruler down, cut, put your ruler down, cut, and move along, this is a case where your stripology ruler will really make your job easier. We'll put a link in again to my speed cutting episode, but if you take your 2.5 inch strips and you stack them so that you have 4 layers, which would be 2 strips folded in half on top of each other, that would give you 4 layers, and you stack 3 across, which is how I did my speed cutting. You lay your stripology ruler on top, you cut 96 squares without moving your ruler. So it is a real time saver if your squares are not already cut. And if they're already cut, you can get sewing those 16 patches right away. I hope if you have scraps, you make one of these quilts, mine or Di's. Let's get to the winners of the giveaway. The winner of the big bundle of scraps is Lady J 6741. Please send me your mailing address to quiltersheaveninc@gmail.com and I will get your fabric out to you right away. And I sure would love to see what you make with it. Be sure you send me pictures after you use them. The new giveaway is some floral fabric, and I hope I can fit this all into the USPS padded envelope. If there's more space, I'll put in more. Nice piece of Verna Mascara fabric from Free Spirit. I'm pretty sure that's a Moda. There's a Aunt Grace fabric. Just some pretty florals. If you like florals and you want to enter to win, you all know what to do. You want to like my video. You want to comment on my video. And you want to subscribe to my channel. And in the comment, write florals. And you will be entered to win. Good luck to everybody. please, if you have episode ideas, be sure to send them to me, put them in the comments, or email me. Either way. And until next time, happy sewing.